straight to our top story. And a Conservative Party researcher arrested on suspicion of spying for the Chinese insists that he is completely innocent. The man, named by The Times as 28-year-old Chris Cash, worked for MP Li Qiang and has been closely linked with the Security Minister Tom Tugendhat. He was arrested in March, but details of the alleged security breach were not made public until this weekend, with Ian Duncan-Smith calling it a remarkably dangerous situation. Responding to the allegations, lawyers for the man today issued a statement saying, "I feel forced to respond to the media accusations that I am a Chinese spy. It is vital that it is known that I am completely innocent. I have spent my career to date trying to educate others about the challenge and threats presented by the Chinese Communist Party. To do what has been claimed against me in extravagant news reporting would be against everything I stand for." The Prime Minister has reacted to reports in the Commons in the past half an hour.
The whole House is rightly appalled about reports of espionage in this building. The sanctity of this place must be protected, and the right of members to speak their minds without fear or sanction must be maintained. We will defend our democracy and our security. So I was emphatic with Premier Li that actions which seek to undermine British democracy are completely unacceptable and will never be tolerated.
Well, I'm joined now by Talk Radio's political editor, Peter Cardwell, who was a political spad himself, and Charlie Rowley, a former advisor to Michael Gove. Thank you both for coming in. I think this is yet another one of those stories which is quite a splashy headline. And yet when you look into it, you start wondering, as a researcher, what would this individual have known if indeed he knew anything particular? You know, what are the sorts of things that he could have revealed? And of course, all of this in the context of this man saying, "I am completely innocent. I did not do this. You know, this is against everything I stand for on earth." Why is this such a big story? Let's start with you, Peter. What is the sort of information that somebody in that position could come by and could pass on if indeed this were to be true, or there were to be any truth in allegations of this kind?
Well, the man named by the Times, Chris Cash, was a researcher. That's about the first rung of the ladder in Parliament, working for MPs. He, of course, denies all those allegations, and they are allegations at the moment. No charges have been brought. A researcher in Parliament is usually often someone in their 20s, maybe early 30s. They work for MPs. They do a lot of work, and what he was doing was actually being involved in a lot of these meetings about the Chinese Communist Party, about the threat from China. And actually, he and many other researchers as well have all sorts of access. They have access to almost the entire parliamentary estate. They go through vetting for that. Both Charlie and I have been through that vetting previously. It takes a while. The police and security services look into your family links and so on. So to get a parliamentary pass, that hard plastic pass that means you can just walk through the door without going through airport-style security, that's quite a process. But when you're in there, you can often go to a lot of meetings, you can drop in on things, you're privy to a lot of things that your MP actually does, and the correspondence coming in, you have access to journalists who are in the vicinity as well, and are often the most junior person, but in sometimes quite senior meetings, sometimes with government ministers as well. So even though you're quite young and inexperienced, nonetheless, a lot of these people are quite bright people, they're young people, they're people who want to perhaps go up the parliamentary ladder themselves later in life. But at the same time, despite their junior position, they often have access to a lot of information and a lot of things like the diaries of the people they work for as well. So there can be, they can be certainly rich pickings for foreign security services, if that in fact has happened here.
Absolutely.
We don't know.
Absolutely. I mean, Charlie, this is a story that has sent pretty seismic shockwaves through Westminster. We've just seen the Prime Minister himself responding to it. I reiterate that the man concerned says he's completely innocent, and so do his lawyers. The Times newspaper names him. That's why we're naming him, because his name's out there, his identity is out there. But why is it so significant? Why is the kind of story that has the Prime Minister throwing his hands up in horror, Ian Duncan-Smith being absolutely agitated, all sorts of other senior government figures saying we should have known, we ought to have been told, this kind of thing? Why? Why is it a big deal?
Well, you're absolutely right, because there is a number of a group of MPs, including Ian Duncan-Smith, that are very sceptical when it comes to China. So when it comes to trade, when it comes to information, when it comes to our close ties with China, there are people like Ian Duncan-Smith that thinks that we should be taking a more cautious approach.
And he's been banned from China himself, actually.
Yes, let's talk about that. Since you mentioned it, Peter, various MPs have been sanctioned by China. This has now become a kind of acceptable phrase. So-and-so sanctioned by China, so-and-so sanctioned by China. What does that mean, sanctioned by China? What is that?
It means they can't go there. It means that they would be banned from actually setting foot on Chinese soil. And what's really interesting is that there is a bit of a split here, because you can't ignore China. China's a huge country, a massive trading partner, and you have a bit of a split in the cabinet as well. You have more hawkish people like Tom Tugendhat, who's been banned from China, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, saying we've got to treat it as a hostile state. On the other side of that, you've got the Foreign Office, you've got other parts of government as well saying, the Treasury, for example, saying, look, this is a massive economy. We cannot ignore China. We have to trade with them in some way. But of course, they have a very different system there. They're under the totalitarian control of the Chinese Communist Party, and it is within the interests of them to have spies in Parliament. And I would imagine, although of course Chris Cash denies everything, all the allegations against him, that there will be other people they've at least targeted, if not who are operational within this. And that's the real worry. And actually Rishi Sunak, who was at the G20 in India last week, he met the Chinese Premier, he referenced him in that clip there, Prime Minister Li, and said, this is not acceptable, this can't happen. But the fact is that China probably have spies in our Parliament, in and around the thousands of people who work in the parliamentary estate. Let's face it, we probably have spies in their Parliament too. So it's that's sort of what governments do.
I mean,
that's
Charlie,
what intelligence services do.
Let's talk a little bit about China, our relationship with China, because it seems as if it's incredibly complicated. It's not like Russia, the Cold War, you know, they're the baddies, we're the goodies, we want to protect all our information, not have anything to do with them. Far from it. As you've said, they're very important trading partners. We get a great many of our commodities from China, plus we need them on stream, or at least on some kind of accord with us when it comes to global warming, when it comes to all kinds of environmental projects and some kind of international consensus. So the last thing we want is to kind of brand China wholly, some kind of hostile influence preying upon us from outside, because we need them to be with us and around the table with us and contributing to our economy and God knows what. So it's highly difficult and delicate, this whole thing, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. And it always comes down to trade, it seems. The economy is always the presiding factor. So under George Osborne, he really strengthened ties with China, wanted to do more trade because he could see that it was the growing economy. It's going to supersede the US. I think it already has done at various points in terms of its economic capacity and output. So it's in the UK's interest to have a trading relationship with China. But then there are others like Liz Truss that was very cautious about China. The reason why, in answer to your first question about why this is such a big story, is because this isn't the first time that we've seen things like this. You know, the spy balloons, the allegations over in America, Huawei. You know, in terms of our infrastructure, our technology, and our infrastructure in this country, you know, the allegations that that information technology is used. TikTok, the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps is no longer on TikTok, I understand now, because of the things that can happen through technology. So it is highly significant, and it's happened in the mother of all parliaments. The UK Parliament is the best in the world. You know, it exports its ideas across the world because of its security and because of its great status.
Okay, well, let's have a hypothesis here so that at least people who are watching and listening can have some concept or some notion of the sorts of information that the Chinese might want from us. So the sorts of information that a spy who's on the inside, in a circle, even if it's a very low rung, we know the individual concerned denies it, but if someone were to be doing this, providing this kind of access to information, the sorts of things the Chinese might want to know. One of the things that seems to be distinctive here is that the Chinese are supposed, according to those people who are talking about their wish for confidential information, to want all sorts of information of the most trivial nature, of the most general nature, the most particular nature. They want to know absolutely everything. But why? What for? What do they need to know and why?
Well, they can really, any information that can be useful in some way. Certainly things like travel plans, for example, would be very, very useful. Things like communications, who's in touch with who, where do the networks go? Because it may not be specifically about an operation, it may not necessarily be about a particular person, but at the same time building up a picture of, these are the people within Parliament who have an interest in China, these are the people's phones we want to bug, these are the people's emails we want to read, but through technology, but at the same time, that kind of extra information, those little conversations, those little things that have been, are you meeting the Prime Minister next week on China? What's happening? all of that is just to build up a picture. And the thing is that because China is so big, because it has so many resources, because it has such an emphasis on spying not only on foreign governments and foreign parliaments, but its own citizens as well, that they have this sort of totalitarian idea of information gathering. It doesn't have to be directly relevant. It just has to be everything. But it is...
I think that seems to be kind of one of the USPs of this whole discussion, doesn't it? That we would imagine, I think most people would imagine, that spying pertains to finding out a particular thing or a particular secret about a certain kind of element of foreign policy or armaments or something. But the Chinese variety seems to be a kind of catch-all of all information is worth gathering, as you say, in a kind of totalitarian manner, which would mean that if you were to be a researcher who was in some kind of cahoots or collusion or whatever it is, corroboration with the Chinese, they would want to know whatever it is you know, both high and lowly, wouldn't they?
I think that's absolutely right. And, to Peter's point earlier on, as a junior researcher or someone that's, you are at the behest...
You've done it.
I have. It's the best job in the world, but apart from this.
Thank you.
But, as a young researcher, you are at the behest of the MP that employs you. So, because all 650 MPs, they are the bosses. So, there'll be some that want you to do a lot of work, lots of research, lots of casework, but there'll be others that might be able to do that themselves, and therefore you've got the time to be able to network. And it's that networking and that freedom within the parliamentary estate which is probably the most terrifying thing, because you can, it's always a talking shop. There's lots of information that can be exchanged. You can pick up little sort of tidbits from other offices, what other MPs
and stuff
like to
that
work
isn't written
with.
down, gossip.
Gossip, exactly, which is all information. Knowledge is power. And so anything that could be passed back or used as a sort of, as leverage, effectively, is what...
And it may not be useful now, but it might be useful in the future. Did those people have an affair? Can we use that as some sort of compromat? Can we leverage that in the future in some way? Maybe not now, but I mean, the Chinese, just like every other foreign government who are spying on us, it's a long game. It's a long game. They want a lot of information. Also, you might be a researcher now, but you might end up as, special advisor to Michael Gove at some stage in the future. Your MP, who might just be a backbencher and not that important at the moment, they might end up as Prime Minister. Is there something in their past that the Chinese have information on? They can sit on it and then use it in 20 years' time. There are all those kind of thoughts going through the minds of hostile and foreign governments.
And the current state of play is so bewildering. The man concerned denies it completely. He has been arrested but not charged.
That's right. He was arrested in March.
Bail, out on bail.
Police bail, yeah.
Police
so
bail.
He hasn't been charged.
Hasn't even been charged.
No. This
Denies it
March.
completely, and yet we've got the Prime Minister talking about it there in the House today, as if it's a really big deal. Ian Duncan-Smith et al. Holding forth about how appalling this is, how ominous, how hazardous, how frightening, how potentially in breach of our security it is. Isn't it a conundrum and a weird one, this story?
It is deeply weird. It is
Deeply
very
weird.
strange. But at the same time, I think a lot of this is... I mean, obviously, Chris Cash denies all the allegations against him, but this is happening in Parliament. This is happening. We are... Parliament is a complex beast. It is a very, very... there are lots of ways in. Whether it's technology, whether it's people, there are thousands of people on the parliamentary estate. It might be a cleaner. It might be, it's not the Prime Minister, but it might be a very senior minister. There are all sorts of people who can provide some sort of information, and they're all, whether you are at the lower end of the rung, or the lower rung of the ladder or higher, you will be of interest to the Chinese.
Absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. And since the new laws have come in, the National Security sort of Act has come into it, offence like this, and allegations of this kind of behaviour have doubled in the last 2 years. So it's an ongoing thing. But whether this one leads anywhere, we'll just have to wait and see.
OK, we'll keep a close eye on it. Gentlemen, both, thank you very much indeed.